We want to welcome you to the Love First podcast. Thank you for joining us. If you are returning, thank you so much for liking, subscribing, and sharing. Thank you for engaging with us each week and inviting others to join us. If this is your first time, you are in for a great treat this evening. But I want to remind you of the purpose of this podcast. Our mission is to catalyze courageous conversations that revolutionize the way we love each other. We believe that having conversations that help us think outside the box, receive new perspectives, can make all of our conversations better, more productive, and healing. This evening, our guest is Jerry Mitchell, an award-winning journalist and reporter. And we'll get to Jerry in a few moments, but thank you again for joining us for the Love First podcast.
Love first, I know. Love first, I know. Lord, take control. Lord, take control. Love first in my soul. Love first in my soul. Lord, take control. Lord, take control.
Okay, Jerry, welcome. We're so thankful that you are with us and that you have made time for us.
Sure.
You are a seasoned journalist. You have launched your own enterprise that you'll be talking to us about in a little bit. But in 2018, you published a book, Race Against Time. A reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. And so we're going to ask you to just walk us through that journey a little bit and perhaps just begin by telling us about yourself, how you got into reporting, and then maybe open up that evening in the theater in 1989 that changed your life.
Sure. Well, I'm pretty simple about how I got into reporting is in high school, I was a career day thing. And so one of them was journalism. And so I decided to sit in on that. And the guy was barely graduated from high school, one of those deals. But I was like, well, this sounds interesting. And so I ended up signing up for a journalism class, and I started working on the newspaper, a high school newspaper when I was a junior. And then, when I was senior, I was the editor. The Tiger Times.
Come on. You got
that hard-hitting publication, the Tiger Times. And
college.
And then when I went to Harding University, I was one of the editors there of the Bison and the news editor there. And I think they were worried what would happen if I was the editor.
We were there at the same time. I think that you did a great job, by the way.
Well, thank you. I was usually making fun of the administration, which I know they didn't appreciate, but anyway.
Oh, goodness.
I was having way too much fun in those days.
Where did you meet Karen?
Karen I met at the newspaper. I mean, literally at the newspaper. So that's where she and I met and married. So yeah, we met. That's the typical Harding thing, right?
Right.
I walked her back to her dorm, one night, and that kind of began the relationship. So
that's awesome. That's awesome. I met Susan during Pledge Week, and she was wearing a rabbit suit. So I didn't really get a full comprehensive view of who I was now interested in. How did you end up in Jackson, Mississippi?
Well, I ended up in journalism, and then one thing I found out when I got into journalism because I liked writing. And what I found out in doing it was I was really probably a better reporter than I was a writer. Like I had that kind of, for whatever reason, this kind of innate ability God gave me. And so anyway, long story short, I'm basically the guy that hired me for my first job. I'm from Texarkana, Texas originally. And I worked for the little newspaper there, as an intern. And so the editor who hired me there became the editor at the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, and basically hired me at the Clarion Ledger. So I started working at the Clarion Ledger in 1986.
Okay.
So,
when you started working there, how long was it until they put you on the court duty?
about a year and a half. I I was a bureau reporter for about a year and a half, which is immense fun in some ways, but also kind of, you're gone all the time. You know what I mean? I mean, you're always on, or put it this way, you're not necessarily gone all the time. I didn't necessarily spend that many nights away from home, but I definitely spent my days away. Like I would, trail off in the morning and not get back till late. So I did that for a year and a half. That was in Tupelo, Mississippi, actually. I spent a year and a half, and I basically covered that whole northeast section of Mississippi, which is just nuts. It's just, it is. It's just, it's an interesting place. It's a fascinating place. And I was always finding crazy stories. And then I started covering courts in October of 87. October of 87 is when I started covering courts. I had covered courts before, so it was very familiar. I was familiar with courts.
So if we fast forward to 1989.
Exactly. I'm in the lobby of or not in the lobby, but in watching a movie. Actually, it was called Mississippi Burning, which is a fictional movie about the killings of the three young men, the civil rights workers, Mickey Schwerner and James Chaney and Andy Goodman, who were killed by the Klan and their bodies buried 15 feet down in an earthen dam. And the thing I couldn't believe after I got done with it, I saw it with two FBI agents who investigated the case, which was kind of fascinating.
Wow.
And then a journalist who covered the case. And then once the movie was over with, all the other press left. They kind of saw the movie and left. And of course, I was writing a story too, but I literally stood there for, probably 45 minutes and listened to these three old men. And now I'm one of those, but three old men basically tell me the story of how, because I was curious. It was like, wait, more than 20 guys involved, Klansmen involved in this killing, but nobody's ever been prosecuted for murder. How does that happen? So they were kind of trying their best to explain it, even though it didn't really have an explanation.
Yeah. So when you see this movie, and, you are not unfamiliar with kind of the details or the highlights.
I knew nothing about it.
Okay.
I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing. Yeah, nothing.
But then now you watch the movie, which I've seen as well, but now you're with the actual people that are caricatured.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Well, the people that are, Roy Moore was the head that I sat by, was the head of the FBI. In 1964. So, in Mississippi. So he was the one that was kind of coordinating all these efforts. And he would have his occasional commentary while the movie, it's like I get this occasional commentary while I'm watching the movie. It's
during the movie.
That didn't happen. And then I remember this, there's a black kid in the movie who happens to see something. And so he's kind of a witness. In real life, it was more than that. There's a whole nother story about that. But he was like, when he saw that scene and they're FBI's driving this kid around, he's got a cardboard box on top of his head, but he's got little eye holes so, he can see out. And he said, that really happened. I'm like, wow, that's kind of fascinating.
So something triggered in you. You realized.
Yeah. Well, I was
never been solved.
Couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. What? Nobody got prosecuted for murder in that case? Come on. So triple murder and nobody gets prosecuted for murder? I mean,
so let's back up for our listeners and let's tell them the story a little bit. We've got Freedom Summer,
That's right. In terms of context of this,
Yeah.
this is Freedom Summer. This is when like up to 1,000 college students are coming down south, mainly from the North and Midwest, but also from out West as well. And they're coming to Mississippi. The idea was Mississippi was kind of the iceberg, or the idea was if we can, basically bring change to Mississippi, then we can bring it, to the rest of, the rest of America. It was just this idea by Bob Moses, who incredibly courageous guy, and others involved in the civil rights movement. That
and they were
so they trained up at Oxford, Ohio, and then came down.
Yeah. And was a primary part of that voter registration?
Main part of it was voter registration. They wanted to register African Americans to vote, which of course in Mississippi, almost no African Americans could vote in that point in time. And let me back up and tell a slight history on this, which is because people don't know this history, and I certainly didn't get one into this. Is you had the Civil War, and you had Reconstruction, which basically was a period of time in the South where a lot of African Americans were allowed to vote and hold office.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had a number of African Americans. Mississippi was majority black at the time. So you had a lot of African Americans, holding office during this period of time. The whites began to kind of regain power by violence and by hook and crook. Like they would, put a cannon. I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. They put it like a cannon in front of where people went to vote.
Yeah.
So in case anyone African American came, they would fire the cannon. That kind of stuff. And then it would kill people. I mean, just lots of people, not just a few people. And whites as well that were, because there were Southern Democrats, and essentially anybody who was Republican was from North,
yes,
or black. There was a racial distinction,
yes,
in party at that point, and so anyway, they killed a bunch of people and had massacres left and right here in Mississippi, unfortunately.
Yes.
And then you had followed that, like I said, the whites kind of began to regain power by hook and crook. And then by 1890, they go, we want to make this legal. Like we don't want to keep doing all this corruption and violence. But the violence by then had kind of begun to settle down. But we want to try to make it where we can get away with it legally. And so they set up poll taxes and a constitutional quiz, and made the circuit clerks kind of the gatekeepers.
Yes.
So that's that, and so that and then basically they wiped everybody's name off the voting rolls in 1892, and so that cleared the way basically for then no African Americans to be able to vote, even though they've been voting.
Yes.
Until that point.
Yes. And so
that stayed in place. That was still in place in the 1960s. So I just want to make that history clear.
And I think that's important because as we see that brief window, 10 to 12 year window after the Civil War, and then you see this almost 100 years, not quite
almost a century,
90 some years, where all of that is shut down. And then you have this vision that, hey, this needs to be equitable. Let's go to work on this. And so you have James Chaney, who's from Mississippi, but then you have Mickey Schwerner and his wife, Rita. You've got Andrew Goodman, Mickey and Andrew from New York. They come from families that
were involved in the movement essentially up in New York.
Yes. And it's hard for us to grasp, I think, that when these college students were heading to do what they believed was the work of justice, that their families were saying big goodbyes, big worries, big goodbyes. And in fact,
Well,
Was it Mickey or Andrew that died the day after they got there?
yeah. Well, Andy did. I mean, he in fact, he'd already written a postcard to his mom and dad. There's actually a postcard that Andy wrote his mom and dad.
Yes.
I just arrived here in Mississippi. The people are lovely. You know, very nice postcard to his mom and dad that they received after he disappeared.
Yes. So let's go back to that. We're back on June 21st, 1964.
First day of summer.
Yep. So, yeah, that's right. So let's walk through this. June 21st, 1964. They are jailed briefly.
Well, they go to investigate the burning of a black church.
Yes.
Where they had some freedom meetings or whatever you want to call them. And then it's been burned to the ground. So they go to investigate. And when they're driving back through Philadelphia, when they're not quite Philadelphia, they get pulled over, arrested, and jailed. Yeah. And then released.
How long? Till about 10:30 at night, is that right? Or?
Yeah, they were arrested around 2:30, I believe, and then they were released about 10:30 that night into the hands of basically waiting Klansmen.
They had a 37-mile trip to make in their station wagon.
Yep.
And that turns into
it turns into a high-speed chase, actually, down this little 2-lane highway in Mississippi. Supposedly, they hit over 100 miles an hour. One of the cars of the Klan actually broke down because of that. But at a certain point, Cheney tried to evade them. Yeah. I'm guessing, this is a guess on my part, I think he turned off his lights. And then as he turned, I think he thought they wouldn't see him, but of course you also have brake lights, you know. So I think they saw him, and then that was it. I think he was trying to figure out if he could, you know, get off the road and evade them, and then it didn't work.
So the way it appears initially is that you have just a straightforward Klan killing.
They killed them. They killed them and buried their bodies 15 feet down, earthen down. They weren't found for 44 days. It was literally 44 days between when they disappeared and when their bodies were actually found.
But there's way more to the story than that, because after arrests were made and brought forward, it kind of begins to bubble up. And as you begin...
they had a federal trial.
Work on this.
Yeah, they had a federal trial back in '67, and there were 7 of the 18 were convicted. The rest of the 18 walked away. So
tell us about, like, you know, you're convicted of cold-blooded murder. You've got Alton Wayne Roberts, who's apparently the 26-year-old trigger man. You've got Cecil Price. You know, you've got
the deputy sheriff. Yeah,
but who served the longest sentence for these murders?
Bowers did, actually. Sam Bowers, the guy that ordered it, served about 6 years, actually. He was sentenced to 10, but he only served 6. So we've got Sam Bowers, who orders the killings, who serves approximately 72 months for a cold-blooded triple murder. Triple murder.
So that didn't set well with you.
No, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I was just like, this is crazy. I mean, nobody got prosecuted. No one ever got prosecuted for murder. That's the part I couldn't believe. You know,
you went to work on it. Where did it take you?
Well, interestingly, as I began to work on that, as typically happens in reporting, something else crossed my path while I'm begin this journey. And that was something called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. So I don't know if you're like me, but if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission was this state segregationist spy agency, and it existed from the 50s into the 70s, and the Mississippi legislature in 1977 voted to seal all those records for 50 years. More than 132,000 pages of files.
Wait, time out. Wait. 132,000 pages of spying on Mississippians, and we're going to make sure that it's legally closed until 2000
right.
What?
2027, yeah. Actually, we're getting closer now.
Does that not kind of indicate that maybe we're trying to hide something?
Well, that's what I thought. I mean, that was my first inclination. When I heard the legislature sealed it for 50 years, I was like, oh, yeah, there's something in there.
So how'd you get a hold of it?
Well, I began to go. Well, the first records I saw were accidentally filed in an open court file. And that is what intrigued me. Like, when I found that out, and actually another reporter, not me, got the tip, then I went over there and looked in court files, and there they were, and I'm like, it was basically this story of somebody working for the Sovereignty Commission as a spy. We're in a civil rights office that summer and stole a bunch of documents and photographs of Freedom Summer volunteers. And so when I was like, really? They're stealing stuff? This is really fascinating. And that kind of led to my main source, which I'm able to reveal in my book, was a guy by the name of Ken Lawrence, who was involved in trying to get the files reopened. And so I could constantly go to him because he had read all the files. And so that it led to an interesting conversation, because he and I are talking, and I'm like wanting to know what else is in the files, because all of a sudden I'm finding this out about this. I'm like, well, what else is in there? And he said, well, take a guess. I'm like, the state committed more theft? He's like, no. It's like, what's the worst thing imaginable? I said, well, murder. There's this long, silent pause. I'm like, and he's like, now do you get it? I go, oh, yeah.
Wow. So why didn't he just give it to you to read initially? Why didn't he just?
He couldn't. These files were all sealed. And so it becomes a bit of a game that you play as a reporter. You got someone you try to basically pump somebody for as much information as you can get out of them.
Yes.
But obviously he couldn't go on the record because, he'd get in trouble. And you see at some point there's an FBI investigation into this. So, anyway.
Got it. So eventually you get a big break on the 11th of December, 1989, but this is in another case. So you start with the Freedom Summer case, the Mississippi.
In October, I think my story ran in October of 89. What I found out was exactly another case, but Sovereignty Commission records was at the same time the state of Mississippi was prosecuting Byron D. Beckwith, the assassination of Medgar Evers here in Jackson. This other arm of the state was secretly assisting Beckwith's defense, trying to get him acquitted, and nobody knew that.
Right.
And so that was the story. I again, at that point, I'm getting leaks. I'm not getting all the files, but I'm getting the leaks. Yeah. So that's the story I did at that point.
So there were people who wanted to see justice, but the system was pushing hard to keep that from happening.
Correct.
And so initially, there's a case. Sam Bowers goes to prison for 6 years. The bulk of the people involved in the killings of these 3 civil rights workers go free.
They did.
And you hit a dead end.
Yeah, the state wasn't going to do anything. It was pretty obvious. And at about the same time as when I found out this stuff on Medgar Evers and did that story. And unlike the other story, which didn't really seem to the stories didn't seem to really go anywhere. This one started going somewhere.
So let's transition to that story. June the 12th, 1963, around midnight.
Yeah, a little after midnight, Medgar Evers was assassinated in his own driveway in Jackson, shot in the back.
So let's think through this. We have
same night President Kennedy delivered his first civil rights speech to the nation.
Yes, and we're talking about a U.S. veteran who was in Normandy during World War II.
Correct.
Fighting the abuses of racism in Europe, only to come home and face this here, where, as you mentioned about voter suppression, he's on his way to vote, and a group of armed white men stopped this World War II veteran from voting.
And other ones too. There was a group of them. Yeah,
right.
They stopped them all.
So he decides that he's going to do something about this. He goes to work on it. He and his wife Merle and their 3 children are in Jackson, and he is working in voter registration. And then, of course, he is shot in the back in his driveway, dies there. As you know, we've had the opportunity, many times, my wife and I 3 or 4 times, to go through that home, to see it, to experience it. But that case also had never been solved. So tell us about you getting into the Medgar Evers case.
Well, so I wrote about it. I wrote the story that I mentioned, and it ran October 1st, 1989. And at the time I wrote that story, the odds were literally more than 1,000,000 against the case being reopened and reprosecuted. There was no murder weapon, no transcript, no evidence, nothing of any kind of value in the court files or in the vault where they kept evidence. It's all gone.
Wow.
And so, but Merle Evers, as you know, the widow of Medgar Evers, believed, and she prayed, and some amazing things happened. A couple months later, Jackson police are cleaning out a closet, happen to find a box that contained the crime scene photographs of the killing of Medgar Evers, including the fingerprint of Byron Beckwith lifted from the murder weapon. A few months after that, Merle Evers shared with me her copy of the court transcript that she had saved in a safety deposit box. And a few months after that, the prosecutor found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet. And I tell the whole wild story, the wild journalism story on that, which, another thing that's in my book, which has not been out there. It's just how we found out they had the gun is more than a little bit of a wild story. It is one of the wildest stories I know.
Do you want to tell it here, or just have people read the book?
I read the book. It's a wild story. I don't know how to even encapsulate it, other than basically Byron Beckwith was the reason we found out that they still had the gun. I mean, it's you can't make it up.
Yeah,
let's tell people.
So here we are. We've got this World War II veteran shot in the back in his own driveway, trying to do good in the community.
Yep.
And because of the color of his skin, that's dropped and suppressed. And
we had police officers lying for Beckwith, I might add, that which was not helpful. He had 3 different police officers claim they saw Beckwith in Greenwood, Mississippi, which is Greenwood is where Beckwith lived. About 900 miles away from Jackson. I'm trying to remember back in those days what exact mileage would be, but anyway, something like that. A good ways away at about the same time the assassination took place.
Yes,
they basically lied. Let's just be honest. They just lied. It's flat out lied because he certainly did it.
Yes, and so you pursued that particular case. And one of the things that you note in the book, and I want us to open this up a little bit,
sure,
is that I've read some of this same history in Carolyn Renee DuPont's book, Mississippi Praying, and as well as some of Tim Tyson's writings. And the idea is that Mississippi had a marketing problem, that the idea is that the outside world and the United States kind of viewed Mississippi in the wrong light, that Mississippi needed the opportunity to tell its own story, that the state we were then is not the state we are now, that we've cleaned this up, that we're in better shape. And in an effort to supposedly kind of do all of that, it was also suppressing all of this evidence and all the opportunity for justice.
Oh, yeah. I think that's, I think there was a certain amount of that for sure. And, and of course, the Sovereignty Commission was designed to, they used to have a little thing that said Mississippi, the most lied about state in the Union or something like that. They were very defensive about it. And Mississippians are still defensive. And I consider myself a Mississippian. I've lived here long enough. I guess at least they sort of consider me one now.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just, and understandably so, they're a little bit defensive. And I understand that because they've certainly been pointed at and harped on. And in fact, I'll say that as an aside. I hope people don't read this book just as an opportunity to kind of wag their fingers at Mississippi and go, "Oh, that terrible Mississippi,"
That's right.
Instead, I hope that the book is a bit of a mirror for people that we can see, how we travel in the same paths. I guess.
Right. Because I think that's one of the things that I took away from reading your book is that when you read it, if our eyes are open, we can not only see those same sins and shortcomings in our own lives, but we can see them in our own locations. The place
exactly. I think that's very true. We got to be honest about that. I think that's the way, as you mentioned, not just individuals, but communities can begin to heal. Yeah.
Yes. So you have a breakthrough in that case, right?
Correct.
And tell us a little bit about the conviction of Byron Dilla Beckwith.
The conviction itself, and by the way, let me add real quickly about Beckwith, because we haven't talked about him at all. Absolutely most racist person I ever spent serious time with. Horribly racist guy. So anyway, he hadn't changed. I mean, he gotten worse probably from the way he was in '63.
Dilla Beckwith. How did you locate him, and how did you talk with him?
Oh, well, I actually, it was thanks to an old New York Times reporter named Johnny Popham, who was this famed New York Times reporter. He used to cover the South for them, really before the Civil Rights Movement got fully cranked up. And but he was kind of a legend for the New York Times. And I called him. He was still, I guess, had an office at the Chattanooga newspaper in Tennessee, and they ended up patching me through to him. I didn't know to ask for him. And next thing I know, I'm talking to Johnny Popham. I said, well, I knew he had a phone number, but I gathered it was unlisted because it wasn't in directory assistance. That was back what we had back then, was directory assistance. And so he basically promised to help me try and get the number. And then he called me back weeks later and had the number. I can't remember how long. I guess it was weeks later. He called me back with the number. And
so what did you do? Did you just call Beckwith?
So I called him out of the blue, and we talked on the phone. And I did a story on him as well as other people kind of connected to the case. What are they up to now? These kind of really mini profiles, not very long at all.
Yeah.
And anyway, I told him at a certain point I called him. I guess it was in April. He and I just had talked on the phone for a while. And in April or so, I called him up and said, hey, I'd like to come talk to him in person because I was going to be up in Tennessee and Nashville, and figured, well, I'll just swing by and talk to this guy.
Just swing by.
And sure enough, he let me come talk to him. And so we spent about 6 hours talking. He lived in Signal Mountain, which is just outside of Chattanooga.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, most racist person I ever spent serious time with. Some people, you get done, you feel like you need to go take a bath or shower or something. That's what it felt like, yeah.
Did you get some insight, though, into the mind of...
Yeah, absolutely.
And white supremacy and all of that?
he was a part of what's called Christian identity, and some people get offended it has the word Christian in it. And I'm like, okay, look, that's what they call themselves. But they're a part of Christian identity, which is. So I'm going to tell this. It's very blunt and racist. What I'm describing is very racist and offensive. So hopefully you'll understand. I don't mean any of this, myself. But they believe that Adam and Eve, this is their theology. They believe that Adam and Eve were white people. They believe that all the non-white races are, quote unquote, mud people that were created on the sixth day. And they're like animals. They have no souls. And they believe that Jews, I'll go ahead and tell this bluntly, this is awful, but this is what they believe. They believe that Eve had sex with the serpent, Satan, and that's where Jews come from. So they believe Jews are the literal offspring of Satan. So it's incredibly anti-Semitic as well as being horribly racist.
So as we try to take that in for a moment, you are a person of deep faith. Your faith has informed your love for justice and your willingness to put yourself on the line for the cause of justice. I remember my wife reminded me of this, that one time my wife and I were in the audience when you were giving a lecture and your parents were there.
Oh, great.
And someone had asked your mother how she felt about the work that you did and her son receiving death threats. And I'll never forget this. Your mom said, something about your tenacity and all of that. And in regard to the death threat, she said, I just had to put him in the hands of the Lord, right?
Exactly.
You have this deep heritage of faith, and yet what you are describing to us is a group co-opting faith.
Absolutely. Let's be honest, the Klan has done that for years. I mean, what's one of their ceremonies is burning crosses, right? I mean, that's a religious ceremony to them. It sounds, of course, obviously, you use cross burnings to scare people too.
Yes, but we don't. Most of the time, we want to try to imagine that people who murder college students that are helping register voters, or people that would literally take a hunting rifle and shoot a young father in his driveway in the back. We have a tendency to think of those people as so far outside the norm that it is a shock to the system for us to hear you as a reporter, having sat with this person for 6 hours, listening to this person describe their theology. That's hard for us, but
it's true, and that's what he talked about. And I mean, I could dive deeper and explain the various passages that they claim, prove their racism, but it's really not necessary. I think those the people of faith understand that that's not what God's word teaches, and it's so God is no respecter of persons, as he makes clear.
So after this 6-hour conversation, where does it go from there?
Oh, well, it was getting dark, and so I thought, what a good time. Yeah, Signal Mountain. I'm way up on the mountain. And by the way, this is like Klan Haven. You know what I mean? I mean, I didn't know all this going up, but this is like the Klan would still, get on the street corners and, intersections where people take up money at intersections.
Yeah.
Klan was still doing that in the 80s in Signal Mountain. And by the way, in case you want an interesting reference, the other mountain right next to it is Lookout Mountain.
That's right.
Which Dr. King mentions in his I Have a Dream speech. I let it ring out from Lookout Mountain, which was a Klan stronghold. Wow. So, King knew what he was referring to.
You bet.
When he mentioned Lookout Mountain.
Yes.
So.
Yes.
And so he, anyway, walks me out. He insists on walking me out to the car. And I'm like, really? that's okay. I think I'll find my way. So he walks me out to the car and goes, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you directly, several individuals will do it for him. And so his wife had made me a sandwich. I think you can guess what I did with the sandwich. I didn't hang on to it.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. So how does he end up coming to trial then?
So that was in April of 1990, and he ended up getting indicted in December of 1990. And then he fought extradition and then lost that battle and then was wound up back in Mississippi. And
and so eventually,
eventually, February of 1994, he was convicted. Jury, by the way, and it's in the book. I love talking to him, but the foreman of the jury was an African American preacher. And in fact, he had memories of the King assassination. I'm kind of interested because he lived in Memphis at the time. But he said, because the night before, and I was very concerned and very worried. It looked like a split jury. You know, no one was, you know, it was just like, oh no, there's going to be another hung jury. And at least on the initial case here, I felt a lot of burden on myself. I probably shouldn't have, but I did. I felt it was probably because it was the first case. If it was a hung jury, I would felt like I was gonna be blamed. You know what I mean? Like, Jerry, it's your fault. If you hadn't have done that, you know, I felt like, you know, that's probably selfish on my part, you know, but that's the way I felt.
You were invested.
Yeah, I felt like, oh man, I'm going to get blamed, you know, if there's a hung jury. And the next, you know, so I was just totally couldn't sleep at all. But I will tell this quick story. That night, Merle, it was like a monsoon that night, by the way. That night, Merle and Evers and I were talking on the phone almost every night. After, you know, kind of, I'd hear what she had to say about the trial, and I'd tell her what I was thinking. And so we could tell the jury was split and all that stuff. And she told me this story that she had never told me before, where when Medgar was assassinated in the driveway, that after he was, then came these curiosity seekers. And this was a black neighborhood that was in the edge of a white neighborhood. Like, a white neighborhood was, you know, literally right there. And so there were some teenagers who were white who were curious and came over. And then, of course, later the police. And Merle told me if I'd had a machine gun, I would have mowed every one of them down. Yeah. Every one. And I was like, wow. Yeah. You know, I think it was hearing that story that helped me begin to understand the pain that she and her family had gone through. Yes. And so she told me when the verdict came in and she heard that word guilty, she felt like every bit of hate and anger came like flying out of every pore in her body. And you know, when the word guilty kind of rang out, you could hear these waves of joy as it cascaded down the hall. Yes. Until it reached a foyer full of people, black and white, who just erupted in cheers. And I felt chills because the impossible had suddenly become possible. You know, Jerry, I've heard you talk about this before. People asking you, why didn't you leave these old men alone? Well, and what I often have responded is, well, these were young killers. They just happened to get old.
I think we forget that, don't we?
I mean, it wasn't like Beckwith was a different person now.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh man, I really regret what I did in the past," and all those kinds of things. But no, not at all. In fact, he was proud of it.
Yeah, and I think something that is hard for us to do sometimes, and what you have chosen to do, is it's hard for us to sometimes immerse ourselves into the context of a circumstance and allow ourselves to sit in it. I remember the first time that my wife and I came to Medgar Evers' home there in Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman who was the tour person that met us there, she remembered Medgar Evers. She had known him and remembered him when she was young, a college student. But as you're there and you realize that they built this home without a traditional front door,
correct,
to lessen the possibility of getting shot. That
correct.
They built the home with higher windows to lessen the possibility of someone seeing the family inside and killing them, that they would have their children sleep on the floor so that if bullets came through, that there would be a better chance of survival.
Correct.
And the family living inside that house was a World War II veteran of the greatest generation who simply sought to help his community. And so I think part of what we have trouble seeing is that rather than these being isolated incidents, like one crazy dude that ended up on Signal Mountain and finally gets convicted, shot one lone victim, you peel it back in the book to help us see that there was an entire kind of like a construct, a whole social construct that was allowing and fomenting and actually affirming these actions as they were unfolding. That's difficult for us to take in sometimes.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You mentioned in the book, you had a conversation with former Governor J.P. Coleman about the Sovereignty Commission that was actually helping suppress this. And his comment to you was, it was pretty harmless. In the book, you say that your thought in response to his comment was, harmless to whom?
Right. Exactly.
So, okay. We are going to have to extend this to a second episode because we haven't even talked yet about Vernon Dahmer.
Yeah.
We have not yet talked about the bombing and the case of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, and you returning back to the Mississippi burning case later. So we're going to have to do that on another podcast. So how about this? First of all, I want to mention to all of our listeners the book, Race Against Time. A reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. This is a fantastic read, a page turner. It's jaw-dropping. It's exhilarating. There are times when I just had to stop, lay it down. A few times I wanted to throw it across the room. I just want to put it out, right? But at the end of the day, we're reading real history, and it's enlightening to bring us to where we are right now. And the other thing that I want to stress to all of our listeners is, as we hear these dates, that there's a conviction, 40 years later or 41 years later, it causes us sometimes to forget that it's not just that person was convicted, but in your story about Myrlie Evers, someone was finally set free from some things that had been oppressive on her for decades. Is there anything you'd like to say to close us out this evening?
That's it. It is not to make it too much of a commercial, but the book is available on not just obviously in hardback, but people like Kindle, I actually got to do the audio of the book, which tickled me. I fought very hard for that.
In your
I did the audio book too.
I love that. Well, I want to thank you, Jerry, so much.
Thank you
for joining us. And we have to take it up again. So, folks, be sure and listen in next week as we cover some more of these cases and we're able to circle back around to that Mississippi burning case. Thank you for joining us for the Love First podcast. And we would love for you to get the book. And hey, why don't you get the book and read it between now and next week? And you'll get a little extra insight on these special opportunities to hear the story of how justice finally came rolling down like a river. Thank you, Jerry, for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.
Love first, I know.